Welcome, everybody. This is Oxford Europe's fourth online meeting, and some of you I know have been to previous ones, and you're very welcome this time. It's a rather surreal experience hosting a meeting online. We'd love to be able to see you all in person. I can see some of you, and I just want to introduce the session. My name is Peter Burke. I'm the chair of Oxford Europe. We have a total of 259 people booked for the meeting, so I think people will join us as we go along. And that makes it one of the biggest meetings that we've had online so far. So it's wonderful to see you all there, and great that in spite of the difficult times we're going through, that there is still so much interest in these matters. I haven't looked at my news feed in the last 5 minutes, so I don't know what's going on in the world. Things are changing so fast. I very much hope that this evening will cast some light on current events in the UK and elsewhere, and that we go home at least enlightened, if not already cheered. In terms of asking questions, many have been asked already, either by email or at registration, but you have the opportunity to ask questions using the chat function, so please do. I'm pleased to say we're a fairly widespread group. We have people in Ankara, we've got people in Barcelona, we've got people in Brussels and Frankfurt, so fairly widespread, and it's great to see interest going so far. So without further ado, it gives me pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. So Chris Gray is, I think, the stuff of legend. He's very well known to many of you, and I'm sure many follow his blog, and I probably don't need to tell you a great deal about how authoritative it is. He has a massive Twitter following. He is regarded as one of the more authoritative voices on the subject of relations with the European Community and Brexit. He's the professor of organizational studies at Lord Holloway, but he's previously been professor both at Cambridge and Warwick, and has had, as you probably have seen in the description on the website, high praise from many people, ranging from columnists in the Irish Times to Jonathan Dimbleby, and many politicians who read him with great interest. I was interested in learning, however, many of you remember that White Christmas is the biggest selling song of all time. I have to tell you, Chris was not the soloist on that, but he was in fact in the choir that recorded with Bing Crosby in the year of Bing Crosby's death, 1977, the last ever recording of the song White Christmas. So that can be added to as many other claims to fame. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Chris. And the question really to ask you, Chris, is what's going on?
I don't know. I'm relieved at that question. I thought you were about to ask me to sing White Christmas, which might have defeated me. And so, well, first of all, I should say, thanks ever so much for inviting me and for turning out in what seemed to be quite large numbers. I guess, in other circumstances, I'd say, thank you for turning out on this cold winter night. But I guess most people, at any rate, have turned out only so far as their sitting rooms or their studies or whatever it may be. But anyway, it's really fantastic. And I recognize just from the names that I can see on my screen, some people I know from Twitter and elsewhere. Well, where are we now is the question. So I'm going to sort of just talk for 10 minutes about that. I mean, the headline is, well, we don't really know. I won't really bother to go over that because Peter has just introduced me. But yes, I do the blog and various other kinds of things. So where are we? Well, I think the thing that I want to say before that is just that I sometimes feel quite irritated by the fact that people seem to be in the media and so on almost sort of treating this as if it has come out of nowhere, and have just sort of woken up to the fact that there's this very sort of time pressured process going on, and all this kind of do or die diplomacy, which is sometimes kind of spoken of as if, oh well, of course, this is what happens with negotiations with the EU, they always go to the wire. And that really isn't really true. I mean, to the extent there's any truth in it, people are referring, I guess, to kind of EU summits in terms of meetings between member states, and the last minute kinds of fudges and deals and so on that get done with them. But that's not at all a relevant analogy to be drawing. And in fact, the whole situation that we're in terms of time pressure roots, I would say, right back to 2016 in terms of this constant internal domestic debate, not in many respects a debate with or a negotiation with the European Union, but an internal debate about what Brexit means, at the same time as actually being in the process of enacting it. And one thing which has sort of been forced into the forefront of my mind as I've gone back, looking through the last few years, is the extraordinary extent to which the United Kingdom collectively, if you want to put it like that, has just engaged in this sort of endless process of internally focused and effectively wasting of time ever since the moment, you could say ever since the beginning, but certainly ever since the moment that Article 50 was triggered in 2017. And if you actually, we've probably all got so used to it, we've almost become inured to it. But if you think about all the things that have happened since then, in terms of the almost immediately afterwards, the general election was triggered, and then when the negotiations began, and there was a really very strong push from the UK to get through to phase 2, because people will perhaps recall that initially UK wanted to negotiate exit terms and future terms in parallel, and that the European Union wouldn't agree to that. That was supposed to be the row of the summer of 2017, according to David Davis, and it didn't happen. But nevertheless, the UK was always very keen to get through phase 1 as quickly as possible in order to push to phase 2, in other words, the future terms talks, the trade talks. And yet, when it got to phase 2 at the beginning of January 2018, it became clear that the UK government had absolutely no idea, or certainly no agreement on any idea of what it was that it actually wanted from those future terms things, which persisted right through until the Chequers proposal in July of 2018, at which point the government effectively at that point collapsed with the resignations of David Davis and Boris Johnson, and went through this kind of endless kind of models of different sort of customs facilitation and MATSFAC and all kinds of things that we've almost forgotten about now. And then, obviously this is just a very quick thumbnail sketch and everyone I think will be familiar with it. But I'm just trying to remind how much time has been used up with all of these internal kind of politics. And then, of course, when we got extension, and you remember the famous Donald Tusk line, or advice, please do not waste this time. And then there was promptly a leadership election within the Tory party, then another general election, also all the time a deferring really of the questions which now face us. And then, of course, once we actually got the Johnson withdrawal agreement and political declaration, that virtually immediately Johnson effectively ripped up the political declaration, almost treating it as if, oh, well, it's non-binding and therefore it's completely irrelevant. So that the negotiations, the future terms negotiations, effectively started on a virtually blank sheet, in a certain sense, in February, really, of this year. And then, of course, in addition to that, the totally extraordinary decision not to extend transition period when it was when there was a process to do that. And so all of these things have led us to this point. And I think it's important to recall this, because the longer that all of this process has gone on, the easier I think it's become for people, particularly people who kind of switch, maybe tune in and out of it at different times. The easier it becomes to actually forget this huge self-inflicted process. And of course, as we've gone along that period, there's all the time that whenever there was any idea about what could be, about what Brexit would consist of, it was immediately denounced as not good enough by the Brexiters, and so we always moved on to the ever harder demands that they made. And so I think that, you know, the image on that slide, you know, is just meant to kind of capture the ludicrousness really of this notion of undertaking this massive sort of transformation at the same time as actually defining what it was that we were trying to do. And so that is what has brought us to this pass in terms of time pressure. And so obviously then the question which everybody is asking all the time is, well, will there be a deal? And, you know, I'm afraid this is going to be spectacularly unilluminating, because I'm one, I think in some ways one of the relatively few people who writes about Brexit a lot, who's really refused throughout the last few months, and particularly the last few weeks, to make predictions about about whether there's going to be a deal or not. And I'm actually, you know, I don't want to sound too tetchy, but I kind of feel slightly irritated by people who are often kind of pontificating about this. And you quite often people say, oh, well, of course, you know, it was always the plan, there was never going to be a deal. You know, there were some people saying that years ago. And other people say, well, of course, you know, last minute there's going to be a deal, and Johnson is going, as he did with the withdrawal agreement, he's going to announce to a great fanfare, oh yes, you know, this was a triumph, you know, we knew it all along. Well, you know, actually, you know, nobody making those claims is in a position to know that that is the case. And of course, when whatever happens, you know, half of them will be saying, oh yes, well, I told you I was right all along, and half of them by definition will probably, you know, will go very silent. But there's no way at all of knowing which side that will be. And equally, you know, you quite often see these things from think tanks and in newspapers and from other kind of commentators of, you know, oh, well, you know, it's 50% likely now. Oh, I don't predict it more than 60-40. Oh, I think it's 70-30. This is all noise, right? It's totally meaningless crap. And so I don't think, you know, there's any basis of prediction. And even today, I mean, the announcement about the abandonment of the offending or the illegal clauses of the internal market bill, it's still a little bit difficult to decode what that means. I mean, at one level, you know, you might say, well, what are we meant to do? Throw our hats in the air because we finally have a government which has said it's not going to break international law. But in terms of what it means, well, it could be. I mean, certainly one can say that, you know, it is a necessary condition for there to be a deal with the EU. I mean, I think that's clear from the EU side, but it's certainly not a sufficient condition for that. And I think, you know, one of the things that I think about this is that people who talk as if there was a plan all along are actually quite naively and extraordinarily imagining that somehow the Brexiters in private and in secret are competent and know what they're doing, when everything they do in public is completely incompetent and ill-informed and ignorant. So the idea that they've had some secret plan all along, I think, you know, doesn't hold water at all. And we could certainly, you know, even as I say, right up to today and today's development, we could sort of think, well, okay, this is some kind of posturing, and at the last minute there's going to be this sort of this triumphant announcement, you know, Boris saves the day. Or equally, you know, announcing to say, well, we did it, you know, we did what we absolutely could. We went the extra mile, but the EU is so recalcitrant and so unreasonable and so denying of our sovereignty that it has become impossible to have a deal. Or, you know, inside that bunker, I think, ludicrous in a way as it is, you know, that they do have this genuine belief of, oh, well, it always goes to 1 minute before midnight and the EU will blink, and so that we're in that. And, you know, I think it's questionable whether even Boris Johnson knows what he's planning to do. Of course, we know everyone is entirely sick of hearing about, you know, level playing field, fish, governance. We know what are the things which are the stumbling blocks in the negotiation, or which are reported to be. And my only just very small point about that is that also the fact that it's those issues kind of goes to the heart of one of the perennial myths that the Brexiters, I think, believed, or some of them anyway, which was they always had this idea, oh, well, a deal will be easy because we're already converged with the European Union. Now, that was always nonsense, because if, of course, if the object of the negotiations had been convergence and we were already converged, then it would be easy. But the object of the negotiations was divergence. And so, not surprisingly, the things which now prove to be the stumbling blocks are precisely issues about what, in what way and how do we manage divergence. And then sort of just a final thought on this is that although I think we're all kind of waiting and possibly hoping, because it's so emotionally exhausting, hoping that there'll be this sort of white smoke and we know what's happening, but I think there's every possibility that somehow what will come out of this will be, yet another kind of, well, we're kind of there, but we're not there, and there'll be or perhaps particularly on some of those key issues of sort of saying, well, we haven't quite agreed them, but we're going to go ahead with the rest of a deal. Let's say if there is a deal, and we will perhaps review these issues, in some sort of future time, and so we may. I think in some respects, we're almost inevitably are still going to be in a position of not exactly knowing, because in a sense that, and I'll go to the next slide now. In a sense, that's because of the fact that whatever happens in the next few weeks, that is not going to be a stable end state. That is not going to be the moment at which we say, yes, Brexit has been done. I mean, I'll skip over the first point on that slide. I think it's fairly obvious, I guess, is that both of these are bad outcomes, and deal or no deal. I mean, I think it's clear that having no deal is going to be worse. But we shouldn't. Whilst I think it's right to acknowledge that, and right to acknowledge that there is a difference between these things, we certainly shouldn't get in any way kind of carried away. I mean, no one should be any under illusion. A deal is a very bad situation, and crucially, very substantially different and worse to what was promised by the Brexiters in 2016. And again, I don't think we should forget that. And people sort of say, oh, well, you can't keep relitigating the referendum. But this isn't about relitigating the referendum. This is about living with the consequences and the outcomes of that. But anyway, to kind of go back to what I was trying to say before, this is not going to be an end state. There will be ongoing negotiations. If there is no deal, then there will be almost immediately negotiations around mitigations for particular particularly kind of problematic issues, say in terms of air travel and haulage and so on and so forth. But I think the other thing is going back to this idea, which again I'll talk about a bit in the second part of this presentation, but this idea that whatever happens, the Brexit ultras will not be satisfied. Let's be clear, that applies to this situation too. They're not going to say on 1st of January, okay, that's it. If there is a deal, they will say, I mean, not all of them, but a substantial and noisy chunk of them, whatever that deal is, they will say it is betrayal. And they are already talking about using whatever the dispute resolution system may be, assuming there was a deal, which inevitably will have a lot of kind of quite tense and difficult kinds of sort of compromises and fudges that will be made. They are already talking about engineering disputes within that dispute mechanism in order to maintain, I guess, a confrontational relationship with the EU. And of course, if there is no deal, then they will immediately push to renege on the withdrawal agreement. And we know that because they've been pushing for that for several months, and because they never really accepted it. And in particular, they never accepted, right back to the beginning, they never accepted that the financial settlement was a payment for past obligations, as opposed to a down payment for a future trade deal. So it will go on and on in some form or other. I mean, I think, this is, I'm not sure if this is optimistic, but it's something, which is that, I think for people who care about this, that we have a kind of an opportunity potentially, particularly if there is a deal. It will be more difficult if there's no deal, but to actually try to reframe this relationship between the UK and the EU, given obviously that the UK has already left. But I think that we absolutely have to resist the idea that the Brexiters' view of this should now colour everything to do with the relationship with the UK and the EU, as if everything was still about the question of whether we are in or out, because of the fact that we will be out. And so so at some point I would like, I mean, I'm not particularly optimistic about this or anything else, but I would like to think that at least we could wrestle from the Brexiters that ownership of what the UK and EU relationship will be, and that at some point they have to accept, goodness knows they've had long enough, that they won and they need to get over it. And I'll pause there.
So thank you very much for that. It's been very enlightening and food for thought. It just reflects how ground has shifted since 4 years ago, and who knows where it's going to shift to next. I've been following the chat with interest, and I see one comment was from Michael Dominicus, who said that sovereignty means unfettered right to shoot yourself in the foot. And I think what you've described, the fantasy of sovereignty, there, very much brings accord with that. I think there's been a very intense debate in the chat about lots of issues, and there have been some pre-submitted questions as well. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Joe Steele to start the questions.
Oh, good evening. We have a question from Andy Anscombe. He asks, what do you think is the core motivation of the harder Brexiters? Was it that sovereignty came first, with that leading to control? Having got control, they want control of the rules to enable them to rewrite the rules. Is it a financial or ideological aspect that they are seeking?
Okay, I mean, I always think that it's either or, but if I'm going to be pushed off a fence, I think it's primarily ideological. Yeah, I've never bought this argument that it is driven by hedge funds or by disaster capitalists or by ideas of avoiding EU tax regulation or any of these kinds of things. Many of those things have been debunked anyway. But I think that we also need to be careful about how we're talking here, and I always try to draw a distinction between, when I talk about Brexiters, I'm always thinking about the leading figures, whether they're politicians or journalists or whatever, and that may be very different to the motivations of sort of Leave voters or Leave supporters and so on. But I think it was, I mean, this is such a complex story, isn't it? But a mixture of ideology and fantasy and nostalgia. I think it's about a completely unexamined sense of nationhood that is reflected in this kind of ongoing sort of obsession and mythologization with war. I think it's about, so it's a sort of an unprocessed response to decolonization, all of those kinds of things. I think it's that. I mean, some of them may also have believed that it would be economically advantageous, and for some particular people, it will have been. Of course, that is true as well. But I think it's more on the ideological spectrum. That's my view.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds from what you say that it'll be many years before we really fully understand what has driven this. Now, if I might hand you to Susan for our next question.
The next question is from Colin, and he says, you explained in your blog some reasons why business has said so little to warn about the effects of Brexit on their business and the economy. Recently, it's become a bit more vocal. Do you think this may continue, and do you think it may make a difference? Well,
it's a bit late to make a difference, isn't it? In a way, the story about that, I mean, I mean, the question says I've written about it on my blog, and I'm not certain that I have, but what is certainly the case is that I did a podcast for the Mild End Institute or something like that, talking about that kinds of issue. So I think the story here is again, it's a long and kind of complicated one. The cultural landscape was so toxic, made so toxic by the referendum and its aftermath, that lots of businesses thought that they couldn't be very vocal, because if they were, then they might lose their or alienate at least half of their customer base. And then also issues about the potential of losing government contracts and these kinds of things, that would also be an issue. Where they did speak out, also, it was very easy for the Leave side to sort of dismiss it as, well, of course, this is the voice of the global elite, and and what do you expect? This is Project Fear, which in relation to this and so many other things, really, absolutely put the kibosh on any kind of rational argument, because everything got kind of dismissed. And there was a lot of evidence, which did, I think, change a bit over time, but there was a lot of evidence that the business was really frozen out of government, of access, well, not necessarily, actually to access to government ministers in 2017 and 2018, unless they were businesses that were, if they were sort of seen as being, even raising practicalities was seen as, but so basically, you're not with the Brexit program. So I think that it was difficult for them in all of those, in all of those kinds of ways. And yes, they have been more vocal recently, and perhaps have also got more media attention. But it really is 11th hour stuff, isn't it? I mean, I think the issue is perhaps, what happens afterwards. In terms of after the end of transition, I mean, and if there is a kind of a deal, then I think that the best kind of hope will be a gradual detoxification of relationships and a gradual closening, at least at a sort of under the radar level set of economic relationships. And so maybe businesses can be more influential that way. But the other thing we shouldn't forget is that if we compare now to, say, the time of the 1975 referendum, that an awful lot of businesses are, they're not British businesses in any meaningful sense. And so ultimately, if Britain decides to shoot itself in the foot, then they will just walk, rather than make a fuss. Yeah, because if you're a business, you don't need to, if I were to leave the country, I might say, I'm going and I'm taking all my achievements with me because I'm so fed up with Brexit. If you're a business, you don't do that. You've no interest in doing that. You're not a political campaigning organization. So you just quietly move. Yeah. Or you quietly move part of your business. And so that's my answer.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I'll hand over to Geraldine for the next question.
Thank you, Susan. Chris, two people were asking about public opinion. So that was Richard Barfield and Sarah Murphy. So what they wanted to know about was, you mentioned in your blog that Brexit will affect us in lots of small ways, which won't be enough to galvanize people against Brexit. And how could these petty things be harnessed to turn the tide for rejoin? And how does that fit in with reports that polls even now are showing that opinion is gradually shifting against Brexit?
Yes. Well, I mean, opinion has, obviously, as we know, has slowly shifted against Brexit. Although you might say perhaps not in the numbers that, to the extent that people might have thought. The small things thing, by the way, that's not my phrase. It's a phrase that was coined by a guy called Tom Hayes, who writes a very interesting blog about, or well, not just about Brexit, but often talking about Brexit. And so he says, the Brexit of small things, and this sort of idea that people will really only begin to sit up and take notice when things happen that actually affect their daily lives. So the other day I saw somebody reporting or mentioning that it was someone living in Northern Ireland who had ordered, I think, a sofa or something from Habitat UK, and had suddenly been told, well, we're not going to be delivering to Northern Ireland after all, because the things like now. The question is, does somebody then say, and then you can imagine another experience, which again Tom Hayes has talked about, and I think is a good example of people will find that now, or after a transition period, that if their passport has got less than 6 months remaining on it, that it won't be valid to travel into into the EU. So somebody turns up at the airport or whatever, and suddenly finds they can't go on holiday. Yeah. So the question is do they kind of shrug and say, oh God, another bloody thing, or do they say, hang on, and also I've got this problem to do with getting my sofa delivered. Oh, hang on, and also I've got this, and also I've heard about that. Do they stitch it together in that way and articulate it as being about, as being caused by Brexit, or do they, or do they not? Because I mean, lots of people, will just not realise that perhaps, or certainly won't make those kinds of connections. So the question is if if they do stitch it together, then you could obviously see more in the way of a kind of groundswell of opposition. But look, I mean, I think the rejoining thing, if that is it lies behind that, I mean, it seems to me as if that's a very, very, very long way off. I mean, I can't, and I say that for two reasons. I mean, one is obviously just in terms of the UK itself. But I think you've also got to think of it from the EU side as well, and I think the only way in which it becomes a viable project for the UK and for the EU is if there was really a wholehearted, enthusiastic swing towards rejoining. It couldn't be, oh, we have another, so we somehow force another vote or something, 5 years down the line, let's say, and we vote 52%, 48 to go back in. I mean, I think if we had a referendum before, a second referendum, even a narrow vote to stay in, well, okay, that would have presented its own problems as well, for the EU, but that would have been one thing. But I think the idea that we would kind of go back in those circumstances in a kind of dog in the manger way with, a resurgent, whoever the equivalent might be of Farage, kind of, campaigning again to go, it would just, so, I mean, it feels to me as if it has to be a generational replacement before we get to that, or I don't know what a generation is, but a half a generation or something like that. And that, by the way, and people often think, and I do as well to an extent, well, of course, that's quite feasible, because if we think about the generational differences, in terms of attitudes to the EU, of the younger people compared with the older ones, but you can't necessarily assume that what is a burning issue, now, if you're a 20-year-old now, then you come to political maturity, if you like, with all the Brexit debate going on, you may feel very passionately about it. But whether that actually carries through to someone in 20 years' time, which is what we're talking about, for it still being the burning issue for them, I don't know.
Thank you. Well, maybe that's what Oxford for Europe needs to be doing next year, campaigning to educate people about the problems they now have. Thank you. And Jo, have you got another question?
Yes, it's a question from Sarah Murphy. So much of Brexit is argued and debated retrospectively, and there's always been a maddening moving of the goalposts and gaslighting effort by the Brexiteers to excuse, explain away their clear failures, lies, and broken promises. Are we doomed to keep fighting this backwards, or might the realities of next year create the conditions necessary for a more honest and forward-looking public debate?
Well, first thing to say is if Sarah Murphy is the Sarah Murphy I think she is, she's been a kind of consistently fantastic, articulate, voice in calling out the madness of Brexit. So
I think she might be, and she's put in some excellent questions to this panel already, so we're very pleased to have had those.
Oh, and there she is on my screen. Hello. Now, what was the kind of the question? I mean, are we? Look, I mean, I don't know. I haven't got a crystal ball, but I fear that we are really doomed to this kind of gaslighting, because I don't think that because it is so kind of entrenched that, at least for the time being, I don't see how we get. I don't really sort of see how we get away from it. And of course, the whole issue about the effects of Brexit, people are already talking about, about how do you disentangle it from COVID effects and so on. And that's going to go on being, as the years go on, that's going to become, more and more and more, more and more difficult to kind of, to separate out those effects. And so I'm not really sure. I mean, again, it's a bit of a cop out, but I kind of feel as if the only metaphor I can think of this is a rather kind of disgustingly kind of scatological one. But I kind of feel as if we can't, until all this toxicity has been digested and excreted, I'm not sure that we can get back to get back, maybe we never had it, but get towards something which is more rational and more calm. I think the toxicity has gone so deep, and it's not even like, it isn't even, clearly it's not even like the kind of the Trump thing, because there's no, because there's no institutional kind of end to it. So my own feeling is that we're stuck with it for some years.
That sounds a very difficult situation. Can I now hand you over to Susan again to ask the next question?
Go for it.
Next question comes from Claire McNamara, slightly different, and trying to get into the head of cabinet ministers. Do you think that the cabinet ministers and senior officials really believed that the EU blinked at the last minute when Johnson agreed to the border down the Irish Sea? And if so, is that why the plan appears to be yet again run down the clock, erroneously believing that they can force the EU's hand, since they believed they achieved this before?
Gosh, I mean, the answer, obviously, I don't know what's inside heads, and we probably need to differentiate between different people. But I think that, I think, some of these kind of, I think the question was specifically about government ministers, but I certainly think if we think about a lot of the kind of the backbench ERG MPs, if we think of the kind of the Andrew Bridgens and the Peter Bones and the what's he called, Dominic Swains, all those kind of people, I think they are eminently capable of having believed that yes, this was a last minute link. I think for that matter, I think David Davis, the man I'd like to say, is the person who has been wrong about every single thing that he's ever said about Brexit. I think he actually also does still genuinely believe that, that last minute link thing. I mean, whether officials believe it, I would doubt. Johnson, who knows? I mean, his psychology is so weird; it's difficult to make a guess about that. But I mean, against that, I think that there's probably a recognition from some of them. I think you can see this from people like Steve Baker, one or two of the others, who are very hard line, but are not kind of Bones and Bridgens, right? I think those people. And it's become very clear since that they really only acquiesced to that deal because they recognised that it needs to be differentiated between what we're talking about in terms of the deals. So when they voted for the second reading of Johnson's withdrawal agreement before the 2019 election, that they did that because they thought that otherwise they would lose Brexit. Okay, and then because of the fact that they had been forced to campaign on that in the 2019 election. You know, even though they had, even once they'd won, they kept that reservation to them, you know, to themselves. But I think they, certainly from their perspective, they knew it wasn't a victory. And they knew it wasn't a victory, not least because at least some of them are actually very close to DUP people, yeah, and manifestly, you know, whoever else has lost out in this process, you know, Ulster Unionists have massively lost out. You know, it's their own fault. They brought the situation on themselves. But so those people, I think, recognised that no great victory had been won, and that the EU hadn't, in that sense, blinked at the last moment. So what they think now, well, I don't know, and it'll be a very interesting question. But I wonder whether they will really oppose any deal that he comes up with.
Thank you. Geraldine, for the next question. You're on mute, Geraldine.
Thank you. Sorry. The next question is from Margaret Elwood, and it's a very short one, very simple. Now that Cummings is gone, who's really pulling Johnson's strings?
Your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. I should think, you know, Johnson's strings, I suspect, you know, I don't necessarily think Cummings was pulling Johnson's strings in the sense that, I think Johnson was just happy to hand the strings over to him, if you see what I mean. I mean, I as far as you can tell, you know, Johnson is just driven by, you know, just a kind of a monstrous kind of egotistical entitlement, yeah, something like that. So I don't know. So but on the other hand, what you might think is that you might wonder to what extent that, for the same reasons in some ways, that Gove is pulling the strings more and more than he was before. And I suspect that might be true.
This is a question that's actually equally short and straight to the point, and going on from the last one. How and when will Johnson be brought to account for his inadequacies and forced to admit that he's been lying?
It'll never happen. It's as simple as that. I mean, you know, anyone who thinks it would be nice to think that there was some moment of, you know, some moment of truth, as it were, where people are forced, you know, to admit what they've done. I can't see that ever remotely happening. I think he will, you know, I think he will, he would go to his grave, you know, without accepting that. So the only, you know, the verdict of history books, if you like, will be, you know, will maybe his comeuppance, but I can't see anything else.
Oh, okay, fine. Not quite the answer we hoped for, I think. You know, you're supposed to give us a specific date when it's all going to.
Well, I mean, it's difficult to envisage, you know, how would that sort of process be, you know? I mean, I mean, if you think about, you know, if you think out kind of past kind of figures who have become discredited, it hasn't really been in that way, has it? I mean, there hasn't been a, you know, maybe I'd be interested if anyone can give an example, but in British politics anyway, I mean, have there ever been a kind of really a mea culpa moment where a politician stands up and says, you know, the major thing that I did was wrong?
The difficulty of proving that his inadequacy is criminal, very hard to show. Should we move to the next question with Susan?
Yes, I think the next question is from Maggie Black, but on my crib sheet it doesn't tell me who it's from. And do you think there is any realistic definition of sovereignty in practical terms for purposes of diplomacy and trade negotiations that would satisfy those currently driving the process? And why are they not challenged to describe what they mean by sovereignty and control, other than that we have to be able to dictate to other countries whatever it is that we want or need?
Well, what a question. I was a political theory undergraduate, so I spent a lot of time in seminars about sovereignty, but I don't. Oh, look, I've always kind of feel like, I mean, I think I'm really sorry, I can't focus on the question, on what the question was. I think that their version of sovereignty is really just a totally naive one. I mean, it doesn't hang together really at all. I mean, the issue would be to do with sovereignty is about an ability to prosecute national interests. It's not about having a kind of having a kind of a completely unconstrained or untrammeled kind of power. But I mean, the sovereignty thing was always nonsense from the beginning. I mean, if it were true that the EU had lost, that Britain had lost sovereignty by being a member of the EU, then it would not have been possible for Britain to have left the EU at all. So the fact that it was possible to leave proved that it wasn't necessary on sovereignty grounds. That's, I kind of forgotten what the question was. I'm not sure that's not really an answer.
No, I think it's just based. Is there a definition of sovereignty that would make all the jigsaw puzzle?
Well, it clearly wouldn't. But I mean, there's no coherence or logic in this. I mean, if the Brexiters' view of sovereignty were as they stated to be, or again, when we say Brexiters, we need to differentiate. But I think we're talking about the real hardcore people. If their definition of sovereignty, that they want to apply to the EU negotiations, they were to apply consistently, then they would not be signing the kind of trade deal they signed with Japan a few weeks ago. And I mean, for that matter, it's a complete mystery to me why it is that you would say, oh, it's absolutely vital that we are in control of everything that kind of affects us, and then say, what's your preferred way of doing it? Oh, well, we want to be governed by WTO rules. I mean, it doesn't even begin to kind of stack up. Not to say that the WTO is a sovereign state exerting its sovereignty against it, but nonetheless, what is it about those rules that is so appealing? But the rules of the single market, which are such an utter affront to sovereignty. So I think if we look for logic in it, then we won't find it because it doesn't exist.
Thank you, Chris. Geraldine, I think, has a slightly different question for you.
Yes, Chris, we're coming to the end. Don't worry, you've been asked a lot and it's a long time to concentrate. And you did touch on this, I think, in your talk. It's a question from Julia Lee Thorpe, and she says, why is it that Brexit ideologues and climate change deniers seem to sing from the same hymn sheet? And maybe that goes with your talk about lack of logic.
Yeah, no, I mean, and also, with kind of, there's clearly a kind of an overlap with sort of, anti-vaxxing and anti-lockdown positions, and and all of those kinds of things. What's the connection? I think the connection is, well, one connection is a kind of a, not just a distrust of, but a kind of a disdain for experts, and obviously everyone kind of quotes the Gove thing, but I think it actually went deeper than that. And sometimes I think one version of what I think was going on with Brexit was, it was almost like, it sometimes felt like the revenge of the kids that hadn't done well at school on the ones that had, and there was some kind of element to that sometimes. And so I think there's perhaps that kind of notion of who are these people to sort of tell us what to do. And then I think there's also a kind of and obviously that's the case with the lockdown thing as well. But then there's also what seems to also link it is this kind of ideology, if that's what it is, of kind of simplism, of the idea that there are sort of simple and straightforward answers to every kind of question, and a kind of a resistance to complexity as something that one should bother to understand, or almost as if complexity is a trick that is being foisted on the on the unwitting and the the unwary. So, and then I suppose also that there are relationships in terms of, to the extent that there's a hostility to international cooperation, that I think that that also then becomes manifest in terms of how you would, even assuming you accept it, how you would respond to climate change, or how you would respond to the need for international collaborations to produce vaccines or something like that. So I suppose there's that kind of isolationism as well is kind of part of it. I mean, if climate change requires you to think globally and about interconnectedness, how can you do that if your ideology is about localism and independence? So I guess those are some of the connections. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And there's just one more question, I think, and Joe's going to talk to you about it.
It sounds very straightforward, very short question, covers a multitude of ideas. Whether we have a deal or no deal, where do Remainers go from here? What is our path forward? What can we do?
Well, the first thing we have to do, I'm afraid, is to stop calling ourselves Remainers, because Remain ended, right? On the 31st of January. Remain is not a thing anymore. I'm not, I know, of course, I understand what you mean, and I'm not, I'm not being, I'm not kind of being trying to be sort of clever for the sake of it, but I'm also not being flippant either, because having lived through these kind of 4 years where this has become such a sort of cemented identity, then it clearly is difficult to sort of recognize that. Okay, so then the second thing is, I think that and I actually said it earlier, and I'll come back to it, is that I think that we all have to do everything that we can do in any different forums or ways that we can influence it, that we have to work towards the detoxification of the relationship between the UK and the EU. And this is because this was the most, and that I think is the next big battle, because we can see there was no reason, even if you would, if you were committed to Brexit and you were doing Brexit, there was no reason why all this negotiation had to be conducted in this entirely confrontational, antagonistic, sullen, sour, grudging, dishonest, untrustworthy way, right? And but it was, and because they were driving it, because they were driving it. And so the next bit for erstwhile Remainers, I'm going to call them that, it's not clumsy. The next bit for erstwhile Remainers is to try to reclaim that, right? And to refuse to allow the meaning of the EU-UK relationship to be driven by these people. They have got what they want. They have got what they want. They've got what they demanded. And so that is, I think, the important thing. And how we do that, well, obviously that depends on, where for any particular people their points of influence and of leverage are. They might be things as simple as in the town that you live in, reviving what used to be quite a thriving habit of having twin towns. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, you know what I mean. And I mean that's actually, in a way, it's a trivial thing, of course, but it is kind of quite interesting because of the way that actually was used as a way of. I mean, it existed before the Second World War, but it was used as a way of creating reconciliation after the war. So it is, things like that are at a civic level. Yes, so those kinds of things. Because if in the end what people want is to see rejoining, then I think that has to be the prior condition, because it's the only way in which you could take the toxicity out of the UK debate, but also, create a Britain that could be a viable part of the European Union in the future. And I would say that even if that long-term goal proves to be impossible, it's still worth doing in its own terms, because it's still better to have good and positive relationships with your neighbors than without. Yeah. And so I think that probably is the next place to go. But of course, the other thing is, you know, and I think this was actually the last line, possibly in the last blog that I wrote, I can't remember, or the one before that, but is, you know, I think we have to accept, and some people may welcome, but we have to accept that, you know, I think it's almost inevitable that within the time period we're talking about for rejoin, I think it's almost inevitable that Scotland will leave the United Kingdom. And I think it's highly likely that Ireland will, in some form, reunify. And I wouldn't even be utterly amazed, although it looks less likely at the moment, if Wales were to go as well. And you have to therefore accept that the context of what do erstwhile Remainers do now, if we, you know, if I'm right that the time horizon for rejoin is, say, at least 20 years, then you have to then kind of accept that the demographics of the population that you've got to get to that position is the most pro-Brexit segment, right? So none of that, I think, looks very easy, you know? And just to sort of also flip that round, I mean, I think that the question of also of the United Kingdom rejoining begins also to get more difficult as well, you know, until the stuff with Scotland and perhaps Northern Ireland has played out, you know, because we are going to be now this somewhat unstable state on the edge of a continent that basically distrusts us, you know, and which is also, you know, in many ways has sort of, I would say, substantially weakened itself with respect to international relations more generally. So, for example, I think that before we see Britain rejoining the EU, I think we're far more likely to see Britain lose its seat on the permanent seat. You know what I'm trying to say? The seat on the Permanent Security Council of the United Nations. I think that's far more likely to happen. And so I think in some way some process has to happen. So this is getting very long-winded, but some process. I said earlier this thing about how in some peculiar way that Britain had never got over having won the war. Yes, or you know, not that we didn't win the war on our own, as you know, as people sort of say, but and that actually, if you think about, it seems an extraordinary thing to say the countries in Europe that had the experience of defeat and occupation and totalitarianism have in many cases, even quite recent histories, in the case of Portugal, say, you know, Spain, have actually managed to, I don't know what national conversations mean except as a metaphor, but have managed to engage in national conversations that have redefined and re-understood and re-articulated themselves in relation to themselves and their past and the world around them. And so until that has kind of happened in Britain or in England, then I think well, let's turn it around. That's the thing that needs to happen. That's the thing that we need to sort of be working towards. You know, I think of my father sometimes, who's dead, and who kind of who had he been alive would most certainly have voted to leave the European Union, and he would almost certainly have. Well, he wasn't much of a joiner, but in principle, he would have been an enthusiastic UKIPper, I'm sure. And I can think of it, but he voted to stay in the EU in 1975, and I can remember that. I wasn't very old, but I can remember. And he had this kind of this narrative, which a lot of people of his generation, I think, had, which was, we won the war, but we lost the peace, and this sort of sense of something has gone wrong. And I'm quite certain, I mean, I wasn't that old, I was only 11 or 12, whatever I was, 11, I guess, that at the time of that referendum, that he voted yes, but it was resentful. Yeah, it was, well, we've got to do this because we've become so impoverished and useless, but it's somehow shaming. Yeah, and I think that kind of psychology of having and that's part of it. That's only one part, but I think that's part of the story about why, why Britain never really became a kind of committed or enthusiastic member of the European Union, even though it massively influenced the European Union in terms of the single market and in terms of expansion eastwards, even though it secured in that respect so many of its strategic kind of goals, but culturally and psychologically it kind of didn't. And I think that was, I think when I think of my father saying that about we won the war, but we lost the peace. So he didn't say this, but I'm putting these words into his mouth. And so I've got to vote for this thing, even though it's a shaming, moment or something like that. And so, how do we have the kind of now? Some of that stuff obviously will disappear because of generations, right? I mean, that's right. But we shouldn't forget how much it transmits between generations, yeah, because actually, I mean, yes, okay, if I'm talking about my father, he was alive during the war, but some of this has got sort of transmitted down, so that I know that we don't want to take Darren Grimes kind of seriously or as a exemplification of his generation, or well, I hope we don't anyway. But nonetheless, you got this guy Darren Grimes, who's 22, I think, or whatever he is, and putting out this stuff about how we stood alone at Dunkirk and we fought, all this kind of thing. I mean, it's kind of crazy, right? But so we can't just sit back and sort of say, oh well, okay. The passage of time and passage of generations will make everything right, if that kind of toxic bilge isn't expelled from the kind of body politic. There we are. That was a much longer answer.
A wonderful answer. Thank you very much. It made me think of a couple of things. Basically, until we grow up enough to assess who we really are, what sort of people we want to be, we won't be worthy of going back into the EU, and we won't get in there anyway. And just very quickly picking up your comment on the twin towns, it's something that Oxford is very, very strong in. I think we're twinned with 7 or 8 different towns across Europe.
Well, that's not twins then. That's octuplets or something.
Very uncomfortable it was too. But yes, it's something that as a city we're really proud of, and we have the Oxford European Association, which was formed after the Brexit referendum and is wonderfully strong and supportive. So if we can keep going with those ideas and build it up, then maybe in a generation or two, we've got a hope of going back.
I mean, I appreciate that you wanted to wrap up, but I'm just looking at the chat for the first time now, and I just wanted to say, in relation to that, I mean, one important point made by someone called Alex Sowden here is, the issue about the voting system is so, is such a big part of this story as well, so anyway, yeah.
Well, thank you very much for answering so many of our questions. And if I might now, I'll hand you back to Peter.
Okay, fantastic.
Well, Chris, how can I follow that? That was absolutely superb and insightful, really enlightening, and with a note of hope, I think, at the end. I think there are a lot of things that I'd like to reflect on there, but I think one of the important insights that you gave me in your column, in your blog, was the liberating effect of for pro-Europeans of no longer being Remainers. I mean, it's catastrophic in many ways. I think for many of us, it has been life-changing. And I speak as an Irish person, and I know that, and for many people, they've had to change their plans massively. We don't have to keep talking about the 17.4 million, though. I mean, how many times on the doorsteps have people said to me, 17.4 million people can't be wrong? Well, as you've said yourself, Chris, they've got what they voted for. They voted to leave the European Union. That's now happened. The promise has been delivered. There's no more to go. And what happens from here on in should not be determined by what 17.4 million people said 4.5 years ago. And actually, what matters is what 65 million people need, and that I think should be foremost in Boris Johnson's mind as he goes to Brussels tomorrow. You raised the question, which I think hasn't often been raised, of an independent Wales as well as independent Scotland and United Ireland. I think I'm just trying to think of how it would be to have a Welsh passport and whether it's going to be blue or burgundy. There's a thought. And the other, I suppose, thing that you mentioned was the idea of this country being an island on the fringes of Northern Europe. I mean, in actual fact, if your predictions come to pass, England will be a country isolated, surrounded like Andorra by EU members on all four sides, north, south, east, and west. And there's a thought for you. The other thing I was going to comment on was the phenomenon of the discontented winners. You've mentioned that in connection with World War II, and also, of course, applies to the referendum. People who say they won and accuse us of being unhappy losers or being sore losers. Well, we're certainly sore, and with good reason. But what's always astonishing is to see how much discontent there is on the winning side. And I find that quite striking. Given us a tour through really much of what's going on in the world at the moment and what's been happening over recent years. I think it's been really incredible. The comments in the chat, as you've said, have been prolific and very complimentary of what you've had to say. With that, I'll just mention the fact that we have our website. I think most of you who logged in will have already discovered that, but please keep an eye on it. And if you want to go on our mailing list, let us know. I know many people will have gone on mailing list at the time of registration, but it's never too late. We do like to keep people informed. We like to act as a conduit for information and news, and we very much hope that you will stay with us and look out for announcements of future meetings. I'm going to once again try to unmute you, in order to give people the opportunity at the end of this really excellent meeting to show their appreciation to Chris in the usual way. Thank you. Safe journey home.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you
Chris.
very much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.